Welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. Today we are going to rehash the information that we talked about in the previous lesson, except we're going to do it within the context of Legacy Internet Explorer, so IE 8 and below. So we will talk about how we can add and remove event handlers. We will also talk about the event information that we can get whenever an event occurs. It's all the same concepts, but it's just done in a different way. So let's get started by looking at the code that we will start off with. It's the code that we ended with in the previous lesson. So that means we no longer have button elements, we have A elements, and by default it will take us to google.com if we click on these links. So we will need to prevent that behavior. We also have the JavaScript code that set up the event handlers using add-event-listener. And of course, we will have to change this to work within Internet Explorer 8 and below. Now, I have IE9 installed on this machine. And IE9 is rather unique in that it supports both the standard event model and it also supports the legacy Internet Explorer event model. Well, I've changed the browser mode to IE8, which means that it's using the actual IE8 rendering engine and JavaScript engine. And that means we no longer have access to the standards-based event model. So you can see that we are actually getting an error whenever we try to run this code because the add event listener does not exist. So let's go back to our code and let's set up these event handlers. And we do so using a method, but we do not say add event listener. Instead, we call a method called attach event. The arguments that we pass to attach event are very similar to the ones that we pass to add event listener. Instead of specifying just the event name, however, we have to prefix that with on. So in that case, it's a lot like the DOM level 0 event handlers, where we said on click, we have to do on click for the first argument passed to attach event. The second argument is the function that we want to execute, and we're okay there. We will need to change the code of this function to work within Internet Explorer, or Internet Explorer 8 and below, but we'll get to that in a moment. And we don't have to specify a third argument. In fact, there isn't a third argument, so we just have the event handler that we want to set up, and then the function that we want to execute when that event occurs. And when that event occurs, we can retrieve information about the event in two different ways. First, let's comment out this code so that we can compare the legacy IE code with the standards-based code. And the event information can be passed as an argument to this function, just like we did in the previous lesson. But traditionally, we typically use a global object called event. This is actually a property of the window object, and you will see me use window.event in the next lesson, but for today we are just going to use event. And this is an object that is populated with all of the information regarding that event for every event that occurs. So whether if you're clicking your mouse button or moving your mouse around, pressing a key, it doesn't matter. This event object is created and given information about the event that occurred. So in the previous lesson, we talked about three things that we could get or do with the event object. We could get the type of event that occurred. We could also get the target of the event. And then we could prevent the default behavior of that event for that target element. And we can do the same three things with Internet Explorer's event object. The first is the type property, and this is the same type property that we used in the previous lesson. It gives us the same information as the standard type property, so we don't really have to talk much about that, except that in this particular demonstration we don't really need that because we are in fact listening for the click event. So type is kind of useless with this demonstration. And to get the target element of this click event, we don't use the target property as we used in the previous lesson. Instead, we use a property called source element, src element. And this gives us the same information, we just use a different property name to do it. Now this is actually useful information because this variable in the context of our event handler is actually the window object. So we can't use this to refer to the A element that we have attached this event to. So we will have to use event.sourceElement in order to get the actual A element that we clicked on whenever we clicked on it. And then the last thing is preventing the default behavior of this event for this element. And as we talked about in the previous lesson, this is an A element with an href of Google. So its default behavior is to travel to that URL. So if we want to prevent that, in the previous lesson, we used prevent default. We don't have that method, unfortunately, but we do have a property called return value. And it is camel cased, so it's return value. And then we simply assign the value of false to this property. And that is essentially the same as calling the prevent default in the standard event model. So let's write this code to get the class name, to prevent the default, and why am I alerting that? I don't remember that being there. Let's get rid of that. And then change the class name of the body element. So the first thing we need to do is get the class name. Well, we've got that through the source element property. So let's do var class name equals event source element, enter HTML to lowercase. That will get us the same information. It is a little bit longer that we have to type, but whenever we write cross-browser JavaScript, then we can kind of shorten that up some. So we have the class name. The next thing we need to do is prevent the default action from occurring, and we've got that with event.returnValue. And then we need to change the document's class name, or the body's class name. So we will paste that in, and then whenever we go back to the browser and refresh, we will see the results that we want. If we click on the changed link, it's going to change the background color to black, the text to white, and it's not going to take us to google.com. So there we go. And if we click on normal, it's going to change things back to what they were before, and once again not taking us to the Google webpage. And there we go. So now that our code is in working order, let's look at how we can remove an event handler after we have set it with the attach event method. The concept is the same as add event listener and remove event listener, in that we have to reuse the same function object if we want to remove this event handler. So let's recreate the function that we had. I believe it was called button click. Even though we don't have buttons anymore, that's not that big of a deal. And then let's pass button click as the second argument to attach event. Let's go back to the browser and refresh just so that you can see that this is indeed working as it should. So our style is being changed. If we go back to remove an event handler, we simply just call the detach event method, which makes sense because we've attached one and now we are detaching it. We specify the same information on click and then the function object that we used. So if we go back to the browser, refresh, whenever we click on either of these links, it's going to take us to google.com because we removed the event handler. So there you go. Let's click on normal. And same thing. So I said that we are rehashing what we talked about in the previous lesson, and there you go. We've covered the same information, we just did so using a different API. So in the next lesson, we will combine these two object models so that we can write cross-browser event code relatively easily. Of course, we do have to write the code first to make that possible, but once we do, we will have a utility that we can use to write cross-browser JavaScript for events. So with that, have a good one. I will see you next time.